Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is great to have you at what is going to be, for the summer, our final Lunch and Learn. Our speaker for next week had to cancel, and we're not going to try to replace that. We're just going to take 3 weeks off because on your table our Lunch and Learn schedule for September through December. We are packed for those months, and we've got some great content, and so I want to encourage you, take this Lunch and Learn schedule with you, bring it to others. It's going to be a fantastic year. We are like 3 away from booking January through May as well, so we're going to be booked for the whole year. We've got some fantastic speakers, great content, and we're thrilled that you're here. If this is your first time at a Lunch and Learn, I got to meet a few of you. Welcome. My name's Brian. I am speaking today. I don't normally speak at these. You normally get to host these, but today you get me. And I'm the outreach pastor here at Wooddale Church and direct our Family Resource Initiative, which is a new kind of outreach arm of Wooddale to our community. And so what we do here every week is a gift that we would love to bless you with. And so your friends and coworkers are always welcome to come to this. We also are happy to take what you have here on the road. So we've had HR directors and others who've said, hey, we would love to provide that for our employees. If that's something that you're interested in, you can always call or email the Family Resource Initiative offices. Just stop in. We're here 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, and the office is here. And we would love the opportunity to bless your company, your school, your hospital, wherever it is that you work with similar content to what we're doing here, because we think it's valuable and worthwhile. We do film all of these as well, so they are generally on the familyresource.info website or our YouTube channel. So you can subscribe if you're a YouTube person to the Family Resource Initiative YouTube channel, and you'll get these immediately, and you'll get kind of a notification in your email or when you log on to YouTube that there's a new presentation from us. We also, in the last week, have put out this brochure, and if you have not picked one of these up yet or taken a look at it, this is everything that we're offering through the Family Resource Initiative, and there are just some beautiful, beautiful things that are happening. Inside there is a brochure on a marriage ministry called Reengage. Last year we had 60 couples go through Reengage, and I got to tell you, lives were absolutely transformed. Marriages got better in most cases. In some cases, we're still working on it, but want to encourage you, if your marriage is a marriage that could just use an opportunity to reconnect, so that should be almost everybody, or to reignite, or in some cases to resurrect a marriage, check out Reengage. The registration deadline for that has been extended to August 20th. We have room for 140 people in that this year, and that happens every Tuesday night from 6:30 till 8 o'clock, and it will transform your life. But we're going to start with our presentation. We've got a lot of content today, and I'm not surprised that we have a full room, because I think when we talk about this topic of difficult people, there's not a human being that can't say, I've got some people in my life who are difficult. And so when you think about the difficult people in your life, I want you to just close your eyes for a minute, okay? So I know that's a little bit weird at lunchtime, but go ahead and close your eyes, and I want you to answer the following question. Who are the first 3 people, 3 people that come into your mind when you hear the phrase, blank is a difficult person in my life? Give you a second to think about that. It's probably not going to take too long. Okay, you can open your eyes, because I'm looking at faces right now that look uncomfortable. I'm looking at faces that, immediately the expression changes when we begin to talk about those people in our life. It's hard. You can't go through life without having some people in your life that cause pain. And what I want to do today is kind of take a 3-pronged approach in our presentation. So the first part of the presentation is going to be kind of a general look at what is it that causes us to feel like people are difficult in our life. What are some of the sources? Who are the common difficult people that people experience in life? And then kind of what is the general teaching? Because you can Google, like, how do you deal with difficult people? And you'll get thousands upon thousands of web pages full of advice on how to deal with difficult people. So I've done a little bit of work and tried to scour the conventional wisdom on how do you deal with difficult people, and try to pull some nuggets out of there so you don't have to do all of that work today, okay? So we're going to take a look at that general principles as a society, whether you're a person of faith or not, what is it that society accepts is this is kind of how you deal with the difficult people in your life. Second approach I want to take today, I am a pastor, and I want to take a look at what does Jesus say, because I think Jesus' approach is a little bit unconventional in how you deal with the difficult people in your life. And sometimes when we read the words of Jesus, we get a little bit ticked off because we're like, Jesus, do you even understand what difficult people are? And I think he does. I think he gets it. I think he knows. He knows you and me. He gets difficult people, all right? Third, I want to take a look at what I'm going to call extra grace required people in our life. And there are some people in our life who, they're like a whole new category of difficult. And they're people that are sometimes termed EGR people. I remember when I first became a pastor, there was a older pastor that spoke at my installation service in Illinois at this little church that I was going to serve. And an installation service is an opportunity for an older and a wiser pastor and a bunch of people to speak into the life of this new minister who is starting. And I'll never forget what Chuck Warren said that day. He said to me, Brian, there are going to be some EGRs that you meet in your life in ministry, and you're going to have to learn how to deal with the EGR people in your life. And then he said, EGR are extra grace required. And then he looks at the congregation, he says, and a bunch of you're those extra grace required people. And then he looked at me and he said, but this young man, he's going to be an extra grace required person in some of your lives too. And so as he has to show that grace, you're going to also, for some of you, going to have to show some grace to him. So we're going to talk about what that means and kind of go from there. But I want to start with just that general question of what makes somebody difficult. And I think I was thinking about just throwing that question out to everybody here, but rather than do that, I want to kind of give a bullet point list of things that we see in culture that you see at work, you see with your neighbors, you see with your spouse, you see with your children, you see with those difficult people in your life that are common traits about what makes somebody difficult. And if you agree that this is a trait that makes somebody difficult, would you do me a favor and just raise your hand, all right, as we go through these? All right, so number one, they lack empathy, compassion, or concern for others. People like that, are those difficult people in your life? Yeah. Okay. Second, they tend to feel or act like they are better than everybody else. Have you met that person before? And sometimes we're that person. Sometimes without knowing it, we give off that error to others. Like we act like we have it all together. When you're a speaker and you're speaking in front of people and you're speaking it as an authoritative figure on a topic, sometimes the speaker is the one that looks like this. Yeah, like what do you know? Come on, like you've got this all together. So sometimes the difficult people in our lives are these people. Sometimes they have aggressiveness that manifests itself as rude or hostile. How many of you had a rude or hostile driver in your life this week? Anybody come across somebody like that on the road? I'm from Chicago. That was a daily thing when I was growing up, all right? Like rude or hostile, that was my childhood as I lived in the Chicago area. They are distrusting of others. Now, for some of you, that might not be where you'd raise your hand. But there are some people who they live their lives in such a way that they can't trust anybody, including you. There's this immediate defensiveness where you have to prove yourself to them. And just being a friend with them or a coworker to them or a parent to them means that you are going an extra mile first to gain trust. And I'm not talking like we all need to gain the trust of the people that we work with, talk with, live with. But this is kind of that extra kind of, I've got a chip on my shoulder, maybe because of something that's happened in my life or something else that makes it difficult. All right, if this is one that is true for you, raise your hand. They have a tendency towards selfishness. Anybody struggle with selfish people in their life? Like, oh, my goodness. And we see it sometimes in our children. We see it in toddlers. I have some grandkids, and I adore my grandkids. And my oldest grandchild is going to be 3 next week, and sometimes in that 2 and 3-year-old stage, you see that selfishness come out because we've all got a little bit of that is innately within us, all right? They insist on having their own way. Who has worked with somebody who insists on having their own way, and you're in a meeting with that person, or there's just no moving that person? And if you've ever been managed by a person that insists on having their own way, anybody have that experience before? That can be really really hard if you feel like, oh my goodness, what my voice doesn't matter in this organization. If you look at employee satisfaction, when you're working with a boss like that, you're seeing constant turnover in that organization because the employee doesn't feel valued. They belittle you or insult you. Obviously, that's going to be a difficult person in your life. And I can't tell you how many couples I have in my office that are struggling with marriage issues, that this issue is one of the first things that comes up. I feel belittled by my spouse, or I feel insulted by my spouse. And sometimes the spouse doesn't realize that they are belittling their spouse or insulting their spouse because it's just such an innate part of who they are. And there's an awareness factor that's missing there. They leave you out of important conversations. Can't tell how many families I have in my office where this becomes an issue, where maybe your parents live in another state and your siblings are taking care of the important conversations, but you say, I want to be part of that conversation. That's my mom and dad too. I want to feel like there's something there. They always have an answer for everything. Guys, we don't all have the answers to everything. And for pastors who get up and speak a lot, I think that's one of the struggles that pastors have sometimes, is we're expected to have the answer for everything. We just don't. I mean, we can't all have the answer to everything. And the sooner that we're aware of that, the better. People seem to avoid them when they're a difficult person. They exhibit toxic traits like pickiness or being bossy or gossiping. There's people who second guess everything you say or you do. You don't feel comfortable around them, and I want to speak about this for a second. There are some people you shouldn't feel comfortable around. And so when we talk about dealing with difficult people today, I don't want to give a Pollyanna-type approach that we're just supposed to, take abuse from people in our lives that are abusers. So there's different degrees to this, and I'm going to say it a couple times today. I'm going to start here. If you're in an unsafe relationship, you need to bring that to the light. You need to make sure there's other people who are aware of that, and then you need to get to a spot of safety and help, and we can help you with that. And I can't tell you how many, almost every week right now in this office, we're dealing with people that for one reason or another have stayed in a relationship where abuse is prevalent rather than getting the help. And so they've enabled the abuser rather than getting the help, and we want to help you if that's the case. They exhibit extreme jealousy, codependency, or other red flags. All right, so just some traits of where it is that we experience difficult people and how that manifests itself. So I'm going to ask you, before we go to the next slide, when you think about the common places that you encounter difficult people, help me out here. Where are some of the common places that you experience that? Just shout it out. Family. How many of you are here? Because family would be where that's happening. You're like, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And does it hurt more when it's family? Yeah. We can't escape that unless we do escape that. It's just really, really difficult. And when it's children or it's our parents or our spouse, again, just so hard. Where are some of the other common places we experience difficult people? Work, yeah. So many of us in our work life experience difficult people. And depending on what your work life looks like, you may be in an organization where work life it's kind of you and the people that you work with, and you're not an outward-facing organization. Perhaps you're more inward-facing, and so your coworkers are who you interact with. Sometimes you're in a sales position where you're interacting with people outside of your organization, and work life is great in the office, but it's the vendors that you're working with or the people that you're working with that you're selling to that can create that misery. Where else do we encounter difficult people? Neighbors, yes. Difficult neighbors. Another incredibly hard situation. So funny, I have a neighbor who doesn't mean to be difficult. He just loves to mow my lawn when it's not mowed on time. And I should be grateful for that, but it irritates me when he gets to my lawn before I get to my lawn. We just have a different standard on how many inches the grass should be. And difficult neighbors. So I suppose sometimes I'm his difficult person, right? All right. Anybody else? difficult people in your life. Interestingly, you hit 3 of the top 4 that if you were to survey people in society, do a look at kind of where we encounter difficult people, you hit them. Difficult neighbors was right there toward the top. Number 2 is a really interesting one. Number 2 is difficult coworkers. Number 3 I found was interesting, and that's difficult internet trolls. So those of you who love to create arguments on social media, this is you, all right? You're somebody's difficult person, all right? Like picking fights that you're never going to win. I have yet to meet somebody who's won a debate on social media. It just doesn't work, all right? So be careful what you put there. And then difficult family members. Yeah, these are where we deal with that. So I want to give you first, before we get to what Jesus says, some really good advice, all right? So when I say I scoured and I looked at just lots of information, and I've read lots of books over the years. I've been like a pastor for over 30 years, and so I've seen just about every family dynamic that you can see and dealt with people of various levels of mental health and just worked with people across the board who we would call difficult. And so as I've scoured what others have written, what I've done is I've dispensed what I think is some of the best conventional wisdom, most common advice for dealing with difficult people. And you're going to see a bunch of bullet points here. And then we're going to get to what Jesus says. So number 1, practice active listening before reacting. So a lot of the comments that I read were just listen, like practice listening. And listening is great. Active listening is a little bit better. What's the difference between listening and active listening? Somebody want to just shout that out? Like I can listen. Yeah, go ahead. Excuse me while I silence my phone. All right. Yes, so active listening is when you hear what the person says and repeat it back to them. So this is what I hear you saying, so that we make sure that we really understand what it is that the person's saying. Husbands in the room, we are notoriously bad at active listening. Let's just own it, all right? Some of you are phenomenal, all right? But I talk to men all the time where this is an issue. And, it's not fair to just pick on the husbands. For some of you women in the room, this is an issue for you. Most of us, when we communicate, are communicating in such a way that we want to have that answer ready or our example, or we're kind of listening to contribute, maybe not listening for understanding. And so when we're dealing with difficult people, sometimes the issue is that we just don't really understand what the issues are that they're dealing with. We haven't taken the time to listen to discover what's the bottom line here. Like so many of these issues with other people would be solved if we would just take the time to understand who they are. Another way you do that is just by putting yourselves in their shoes, right? It's the old expression of walking a mile in their shoes. Some of the most difficult people in my life are people who, when I've stopped and I've thought about, oh my goodness, that person's going through the ringer right now, and I can't imagine what it would be like to go through what he's going through or she's going through, and I put myself in their shoes and I begin to think through, how would I react if my spouse was leaving me right now? How would I react if I was underperforming at work and had a boss who reminded me of that all the time? How would I react if my father had abused me for years? Like, where would I be at in my life? So trying to put yourself in their shoes. Identify their hidden need. And again, this goes hand in hand with the active listening deal. But sometimes there's a need that person has that maybe they don't even really fully grasp what it is that their need is. But it's working to identify, okay, what is it that this person really needs? Do they need some recognition at work? Does nobody ever recognize what it is that they're doing? Does my spouse, who I'm having trouble with, feel like I never contribute anything at home and I'm just not appreciating the work that they've done? Does my child think I only want to speak to them but never want to listen to them? And I'm not listening to their point of view because they feel like, Dad, you're so close-minded. You've already made up your mind and you're not even willing to listen to my point of view. And that doesn't mean that your point of view is going to change. It just means that you're going to listen to their point of view. You're going to try to identify what is this hidden need. Maybe get someone else's perspective, but do it without gossiping. So if you don't have that confidant at work, at home, in a friendship relationship that you know you can go to them and say just about anything and know it's going to stay right there, um, we need to work on finding that for you. In church life, we say God didn't create you to live alone. He created you to live in community. And so for many people, we struggle with dealing with the difficult people in our life because we don't have enough community in our life to be able to deal with that. So for some of you, it may be that you need to expand your umbrella of relationships. You need to expand the people who are in that circle. And if that's something that you struggle with, if you're an introvert, people don't believe it because I speak a lot and I have very outward-facing jobs, but I'm an introvert, all right? If you got here early, I didn't show up in this room until right before things happened today, and that's because I was in my coworker's office who was in a meeting upstairs hiding because I hate doing this, all right? I struggle with this. And so as an introvert, the idea for me early on in marriage of being in a group with other people was like vomit. Like there's not a chance in the world I want to talk about my feelings in a group with other men and women. And my wife's like, Brian, I think we need to be in a small group. And I'm like, yeah, you be in a small group. They have these women's groups at church. You can do that. I'm gonna when you're there, watch TV. I'm just gonna veg out. I don't need other people in my life is how I felt. I'm like, I got you. I'm good. I love you, honey. I had no problem saying I love you. I was not very Scandinavian. I could keep telling her that. But what my wife needed was a husband who recognized the relationships are important. 7 years into our marriage, my wife started to have panic attacks. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I got to fix my wife. I don't know what to do, but I'm just like a fixer because that's what guys do. We just fix stuff, even our wives. Well, I find out that she's having panic attacks because her husband never listens to her and doesn't understand how important this need for relationships with other people is. And so we started to attend a small group together and see a counselor together. And I got to tell you, it was the small group that helped save our marriage. It was the relationships with others. When she saw me begin to open up with others, like ever since that point, I've had a band of brothers in my life. And these are the people in my life that I know I can go to anybody with. When you're a pastor serving at a church, no matter what church you're at, like sometimes you need some pastors who don't serve at your church that you can go, man, my boss is a jerk. Because they know my boss isn't a jerk. I love my boss, all right? But sometimes you need that person that's just safe, that you can talk to. And they'll know, Brian doesn't mean that. He's just having a hard day. And they can reflect back at me, Brian, what's really the problem here? I can say, maybe you're just not seeing it the way somebody else is seeing it. Or I can say, oh my goodness, my wife today is driving me a little bit nuts. They know I love Cindy. And they're like, well, Schulenburg, you're probably driving her nuts too, right? And can speak and reflect truth back to me. Get somebody else's perspective without gossiping, without tearing them down. Honor both of your needs by compromising where appropriate. Somehow, there are some people who have gone through life that believe that compromise means losing. And it doesn't. Compromise doesn't mean that you have given up to the point where you're just a doormat. Compromise means how do we work this out in such a way that both of us feel understood and we both feel like we've gained something in the end. I'm a pastor. I'm also a real estate agent. And in the real estate part of my life, compromise is part of almost every transaction, right? Like you can't sell a house in Minnesota. You have this thing called the inspection period. And in the inspection period, the buyers want to get everything they can out of the sellers. They're like, we're going to take him for what we can get. And the seller's just going, Lord, please, is there such a thing as an inspection waiver? I just don't want anybody to inspect my home because I don't want to give up anything. I already feel like I've given up enough. And we've got to get to the point in those relationships where both parties feel heard, understood, valued, and they feel like they're winning in that transaction. Now, in a real estate transaction, those people are going to come and go in your life, and you're going to forget about it a month later. But in a marriage where there's no compromise, oh my goodness. And again, put yourself in the shoes of your kids. If the issue right now is with your children and they feel like, man, mom and dad never, ever give me an inch, let's try to help them win on something. let's try to understand that hidden need. Is there an inch that we can give where they can win? And it's really hard when we're talking about values and we're talking about things that we know to be true. And so I'm not saying you give an inch on truth, but I'm saying that maybe there's an inch that you can find, that you can give, all right? Give a peace offering. Sometimes a small gift, that neighbor who's driving you nuts, to suck it up and say, I made a coffee cake for breakfast today, and I'm going to bring over some slices to my neighbor. Just to say, hey, thanks for being a good neighbor, even when they're not, right? And thanks for caring. It is amazing what a small gift can do. There's a reason that business people give gifts to clients, right? Because it gains goodwill. It's the same thing in other relationships too. What's a thoughtful gift that I can give to that person? Oh my goodness, I got in a fight with my husband, and he loves to golf. Maybe the thoughtful gift is, hey, I saw these really cool golf tees. That was cheap, but I bought them because I was thinking about you, and I know that you love that. Or thinking about your wife, and you're going to Cub Foods, and you're getting your groceries, and you pass that flower section, and you go, you know what? I'm going to get more than the milk that she asked for. I'm going to get her some flowers too, because it's been a long time since I've done that, and I'm going to fill that vase today to say I love you and I care about you. Peace offerings go a long way. Offer sincere compliments. Can't tell you how many things that I read that said, offer compliments. But compliments void of sincerity really don't mean much. Some of you are words of affirmation people. You can give compliments with the best of them. I mean, it's your native language. And last week we had a presentation here on the 5 love languages. If you missed it, you can go online and watch it. One of the things they said is that words of affirmation are the number 1 love language in America. And we tend to speak with the love language that's our love language. And so if that's the most common love language, some of you are really good at compliments. But sincerity in a compliment goes a long way. So when you look at your spouse and you say, boy, you look beautiful today. What about her looks beautiful today? What about him are you proud of? What about your kids are you proud of? Look for those sincere things that you can tell them, because it builds. And when you're dealing with a difficult person, when you hear that sincere compliment, it changes some of the tenor of that relationship, all right? Practice. Here's what I mean by this. Every one of us are going to have these difficult people that we deal with, and probably every day of our life, there's somebody that we're going to be in conflict with. Some of you are like, in general, peacemakers, but even if you're like a peacemaker by nature, there's probably somebody who, again, didn't take long today when I asked you to close your eyes and think about people who you're struggling with, for you to come up with some names there. And so practicing dealing with difficult people, if you've got a confrontation and you're not a confrontation person, it might mean that you practice that with your spouse. If it's going to be a confrontation at work, and just kind of role play that a little bit, or with your group, again, that you trust, that you can tell things to when you're not gossiping about people, to just say, hey, I've got this confrontation. Can you role play this with me a little bit? Because I'm going to have a difficult conversation that's coming up, and I need some help getting some feedback. So mirror back to me what it is that you're hearing. Don't demand change, but explain how their actions make you feel. So we, in our marriage ministry Reengage that we talked about earlier today, one of the principles in there is that I am my marriage's biggest problem. And the idea there is this, that I can't change Cindy, and she can't change me, really. I mean, she can pray for me, she can encourage me to make some changes in my life, but ultimately I'm responsible for the changes that have to happen in my life, and she's responsible for the changes that she has to make in her life. So if I were to go to Cindy and say, hey, Cindy, I really can't stand it when you do this. Would you just change? How's it going to make her feel? Or every time you do this, immediately you're on the defensive. So telling somebody that they have to change is something that doesn't normally go over well. Now, the exception to this is going to be in areas of abuse, in areas where you've been mistreated. And again, so like, it is okay to demand change and say, I will not stay in this relationship if this continues. And but demanding doesn't normally work well in this. Try not to take their behaviors personally, and know what triggers you about their behavior. Again, there's again those faces that you saw at the beginning of this presentation. are people that sometimes trigger you. And there are behaviors that they have that are going to trigger you. And so try to identify, what are those behaviors that are triggering me right now, and how do I not take this personally? If this is something that everybody that this person is interacting with is kind of relational carnage on the road, then I have to understand this is a deficiency maybe in that person and not so much me. All right, this is like it's not me, it's them. And so how do I pray for that person to help them come along? Find someone who may be able to offer help. And so different than kind of that band of brothers idea, who do I talk to without gossiping? This might be now I've got to have that confrontation at work. And is it something that I'm going to do alone? Or is it something that I can do in concert with somebody else? And oftentimes it's going to be something you have to do alone, because to bring somebody else in would be inappropriate. But at other times, maybe there's a mediator or somebody that can help, or at least, again, give some good advice. When all else fails, eject. All right? This is okay. My brother-in-law is a fighter pilot. He's a general in the Air Force, and he set all these records in flight school at the Air Force Academy for just kind of the stunts that he can do, and what he does is amazing. And when I get the opportunity to talk to him about the missions that he's had over the years, he's told me on occasion of some stories where the pilot has had to eject. Like all else has failed, and there is a multi-million-dollar aircraft that is about to be destroyed, but you can also destroy the life if the pilot doesn't eject. It is really hard. I can't imagine being that pilot in that situation, pressing that eject button, knowing that you're about to crash a plane. Your career may be over, it may be done, but at least he's going to be alive. At least she's going to be alive. She gets to the end of that. There comes a point where you've tried everything that you can try, and it is okay to eject. You've been trying to save the marriage for years, and yet the biblical grounds are there for divorce. You've done everything that you can do, but to stay in the relationship means that abuse is going to continue. I'm in an unsafe place. My children are unsafe. It is okay sometimes to eject. It is okay sometimes to say, I cannot continue to work at this corporation if this is going to be my boss, and I'm going to continue to experience the abuse that I'm experiencing at work. I've tried to hold out as long as I could. I've tried everything that I can, but sometimes everything fails, and eject is okay. And by the way, when you eject and you get to the to the ground, that pilot is also saying, oh, I'm relieved. I'm here. I'm alive. And while there's some consequences I'm going to have to deal with, I'm alive. And sometimes that's what it feels like when you finally make that decision to eject in that relationship. Whew, okay, I can breathe again. Distance yourself and limit interaction. When you have somebody in your life that you've ejected on that relationship, it is also okay to distance yourself and to limit interaction with that person, that abusive boss, that neighbor. Sometimes, unfortunately, the situation with a neighbor means one of us has got to go because it's just too much. All right, so sometimes that has to happen. And then finally, practice self-care. So many of us are really, really, really good at helping others get the care and the help that they need, but we're really lousy about practicing the care ourselves. And so self-care is going to look different to different people. Obviously, what you eat and exercise and all those things matter. What are those hobbies that you love? What are the things that bring you life? And look for those opportunities to do that. Okay, one last thing. Take a good look in the mirror, because you may be the one that everyone else has an issue with, all right? So if every relationship in your life is a relationship that just kind of ends up being destructive, and you're like, what is wrong? Why can't any of the relationships in my life work? It might be time to have a conversation with somebody who loves you enough and cares about you enough to help you understand how others view you. And again, I want to be sensitive here, because I work with people often who struggle in relationships and maybe can't see themselves and the way that they're projecting themselves to others. Having a trusted voice who will lovingly tell you what you need to hear is a gift. In Minnesota, we are really great at being passive aggressive. We don't like to say the truth if it's going to make us feel uncomfortable in this state. sometimes we need the person who loves us enough to tell us the truth so that we can work on some of those character flaws. And listen, I'm convinced there's not a person who can't overcome some of those character deficiencies if we're willing to do the work that it takes, okay? So this is kind of the practical advice that you're going to find in books, online, with psychologists and counselors all over the place, and any number of those bullet points that you could go deeper. By the way, every one of those bullet points can be a book, and probably is, and there's probably a series of books on every one of those bullet points, okay? So what does God say about this? And I want to suggest that the foundation of all healthy relationships is love. Here's the deal. Jesus is asked at some point in his ministry, hey, rabbi, teacher, what's the most important commandment of them all? Now, the people who asked Jesus that question were some of the difficult people in Jesus' life. They were the guys who were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders. It cracks me up that for God, the difficult people were the religious leaders of the day. Like, they drove him nuts. And they were always trying to trap Jesus into saying something that was going to get him in trouble. And ultimately, Jesus ends up going to a cross, and he's crucified by the same people who are asking him this question. And so they say, okay, Jesus, hot shot, teacher that everybody's listening to instead of us, tell us, what's the greatest commandment of them all? Because they know if he says one commandment is greater than the other, they've got him trapped, because they all have like their groups that believe this commandment's more important than this commandment. It was like a legalistic religion, all right? And Jesus sums it all up by saying this, you know the commandments. This is the greatest. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. When it comes to relationships in our life, we've got to understand that love is the foundation of healthy relationships. And Jesus isn't the only one who talks about it. By the way, he says to love your neighbor as yourself. And if you don't love yourself, you're going to have a really hard time being somebody who's not a toxic person in other people's lives. If you're struggling with like that last question I had, do all of your relationships kind of tend to break down around you? It could be because you've never learned to love yourself. You've never learned to love the person that God created you to be. You see, as a pastor and a Christian, I believe that what the Bible teaches is true, and I believe that what it says about love is beautiful. And what it says about us as human beings is that we were created in the image of an infinite God, a perfect God with infinite worth and value. That there was thought that was put into you, that God saw you before you were born, before you began to breathe. He scheduled every day of your life. Like, you all in this room are treasures. Whether or not you're somebody's extra grace required person, like, God is crazy about you. And by the way, that person that's driving all of us nuts, God's crazy about them too. Like that person that right now, when you close your eyes, just brings you anxiety and angst, like they were created in the image of God with infinite worth and value. That person that, you know, every once in a while, we have to like have, even at a church, say, you can't be here for a season because you're dangerous to people here, or but God still loves that person with infinite worth and value. That person that's in prison right now, God created and loves with infinite worth and value. So here's the deal. There's so many passages in the Bible that speak about love. 1 Corinthians 13 is the one you hear at weddings all the time. Love is patient. Love is kind. It doesn't envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Whew, did you hear that last part? That keeps no record of wrongs. All right, so we're talking about difficult people. And when you deal with difficult people, we tend to keep records of wrongs, all right? So really, God? Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. Okay, so that's Paul who writes this. Paul, by the way, is a guy that God loved so much that when he was going to kill a bunch of Christians, like God got a hold of his life on a road to Damascus. That's the guy who writes this, all right? Like he was overwhelmed by a God who would love someone like him so much. And I hope we can get there. Like if you get nothing else out of today, my hope is that you could say, oh, I'm loved. I'm valued. And whether or not my spouse is treating me that way right now, my boss is treating me that way right now, my neighbor's treating me that way right now, the internet trolls are treating me that way right now, God created me with infinite worth and value. And my value isn't based upon what everybody else thinks about me. It's based upon the fact that I am created in the image of a God who loves like this. And by the way, when Paul wrote these words, he knew that it would be impossible for any one of us to love like this. We can't do that apart from God working in us. Because left to ourselves, let's be honest, we're not really patient people. We do keep records of wrongs. We aren't always kind. We do kind of seek after our own needs. I mean, these are traits that apart from God working in our life, we just don't exhibit. So Jesus preaches this sermon in Matthew 5. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. If you've never read Matthew 5 through 7 in the New Testament, and you are like a person who's like, man, this whole church thing, I don't get it. Like Matthew 5 through 7 is what Jesus says that people who follow him should live like. And unfortunately, it is not a picture of what many people in church live like. And so when people are like, man, I can't stand what Christians are like, they're so, hypocritical and that kind of thing, it's because we don't live the way that Jesus talks about in Matthew 5 through 7. C.S. Lewis was this amazing scholar. He wrote lots of books. He wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, but he also wrote books like Mere Christianity and these just really deep books. And some professor heard that C.S. Lewis didn't like the Sermon on the Mount. And he's like, listen, it's not that I don't like the Sermon on the Mount. It's just that I don't like who I am when I look at the Sermon on the Mount. He goes, it's just I really struggle with who I am when I read what Jesus says I'm supposed to look like. And he begins with these Beatitudes and like how it is that we're supposed to live our lives. And they're kind of these upside down principles that don't make sense in society. And then he gets like toward the end of Matthew 5, that chapter that starts with the Beatitudes, he starts talking about our relationships with others. And he says this, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, all right? So like that was an Old Testament law. So the Jewish people in Jesus' day, they were like, hey, we can, all we have to do is love our neighbor. But it is okay if we hate our enemy. And Jesus is like, that's what you've heard. That's up to this point, up to the time that I've come. This is what it is that you've heard. But then he says, I'm going to turn that upside down. And I want to show you in the Old Testament what some of the law said. Like in Leviticus, it says, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against one of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So God's like giving these principles to the children of Israel. He says, hey, you need to be somebody who loves your neighbor as yourself. Don't hold grudges, all right? And that was one of the principles for living in Jewish culture in the Old Testament. In Proverbs, Solomon, wisest man who ever lives but does boneheadish stuff, says this, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink. Now, Solomon was a king who engaged in a lot of war. He understood enemies, all right? But there was this principle for this warrior king that was like, listen, if you're in a battle and your enemy's hungry or they're dying there on this, like take care of them. Give them food to drink. Give them something to eat. Even a warrior king said that. In Exodus, if you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to take it back to him. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you falling down under his load, do not leave it there. Be sure to help him with it. Remember all those principles we talked about earlier? Sometimes you give a gift to somebody who is driving you crazy. Like that goes even way back to here. Your enemy's got an issue, and with their animal who is important for them to be able to live life, well, bring it back to them, all right? So Jesus says, listen, you've heard from your religious leaders that you can love your neighbor but hate your enemy. And then he goes on, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And when you think about the difficult people in your life today, I wonder what it is that you're doing with them. Now, most of us who are parents, if the difficult people in our life are our kids, we love them and we pray for them. And we're maybe even tired of praying for them. Like we're like, Jesus, we get that. But when the enemy or the person that's the difficult person in our life isn't that close to us, then maybe we struggle with Jesus' words here. But what he's telling us is that loving and praying for our enemy or the difficult person in our life, it really helps us be a little bit more like God. And I could go on and on, but for time, I want to keep us moving along. In Matthew 5:45, he says that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So when we have these enemies in our life or these difficult people in our life, to recognize, when Jesus says to be sons of our Father in heaven, it was a Jewish way of saying that you would be like your heavenly Father. So it should be the goal of all of us to reflect Christ. And he's just like, listen, if you reflect Christ, recognize that God is at work in everybody's life. He's sending rain on the good and the bad. He's like working in people's lives, and we can either help those people who are difficult in our life take a step closer to God or further away. So I love baseball. Anybody know who this guy is on the screen? Wade Boggs, all right? So if you're not a baseball fan, Wade Boggs is an old pitcher because this guy was playing when I was a teenager, but Wade Boggs played for the Boston Red Sox. He was known for eating fried chicken before every game. He had all these crazy quirks, but he was an amazing baseball player who led the American League in batting. And at some point in his life, as a pro player, Wade Boggs had an encounter with Jesus. It was a little bit like the Apostle Paul. Like, he was like the least likely player on the Boston Red Sox to have a conversion to Christianity, and he did. And if you know anything about the Red Sox, you know that they have a rival team. Who's the rival of the Red Sox? The Yankees, all right? So the Yankees and the Red Sox, they hate each other, all right? Like, they would be the difficult people in each other's lives. And Boggs used to hate playing at Yankee Stadium. It's ironic because he would eventually become a Yankee and play there as a third baseman. And it wasn't because of the players in the Yankees. They never gave him that much trouble. But there was a fan at Yankee Stadium. If you think fans don't get in the head of players at games, you are wrong. There are all sorts of videos online of players going into the stands to defend themselves because of what they're hearing. And there's this guy that would torment Wade Boggs with obscenities and insults every time he would come to Yankee Stadium. Now, Boggs is a brand new follower of Jesus. And so he goes, Lord, what do I do in this situation? Like, I don't know what to do. Hate this guy. Can't stand this guy. I only want to be at this game tonight. And so one day before the game, Boggs is warming up at third base, and the fan begins this typical routine. Hey, Boggs, you're a bum. You stink. You couldn't. And Boggs decided he'd had enough. So he walks over to this guy in the stands who's sitting there in the stands, and he takes out a baseball from the back of his pocket, and he signs it, and he gives it to the guy in the stands, and he leaves. And the guy becomes the biggest Wade Boggs fan in the history of the Yankees. I mean, never again did that guy torment him because he made a decision. I'm going to love that turkey who keeps screaming at me, and I'm going to do something unexpected. You know, loving and praying for our enemies sets us apart from the rest of the world, and that's kind of what Jesus is getting at. He's like, listen, I know that our natural response is going to be to kick and to scream and to defend and to get back and to try to make their life miserable. But I want you to do this different. In Matthew 5:46-47, it says, if you will love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? In other words, it's really easy to love people who treat you well. And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Don't even the pagans do that. Yeah, we're different when we begin to show love to others in a way that society doesn't expect. In a way that maybe those who are difficult in our life aren't expecting either. It's this famous fight that Muhammad Ali had back in the day, and it was an amazing heavyweight battle. And he's gonna. It was one of those fights toward the end of Ali's career. It's 1976, and Ali still looks like somebody I wouldn't want to mess with there. But he's gonna fight the heavyweight champion of Belgium. And just in case you're wondering, the heavyweight champion of Belgium's name was Jean-Pierre Koopman. Remember that heavyweight champion? No, none of us know who this guy is, right? But it was obvious from the first press conference that Koopman was a huge fan of Muhammad Ali. He loved Muhammad Ali. And this Belgian man in his Belgian culture starts hugging and kissing Muhammad Ali and asking him for autographs at that press conference where it's normally like, hey, come on, you want a piece of me? I want a piece. You know, like instead of that, the guy's hugging him and kissing him. And Ali says, how am I supposed to get myself mad enough to fight this guy if he keeps hugging me and kissing me? He's taking all the fight out of me. And the Sports Illustrated writer says that's exactly kind of what Jesus did too. You know, like he took the fight out of his enemies. And that's what he's calling us to do. In Romans 12:1, it says, don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. You know, the chapter in Matthew 5 ends with these incredible words. So, by the way, if you've never read again, the Sermon on the Mount starts with these Beatitudes, and the first of the Beatitudes is about blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And people sometimes misunderstand that. They're like, okay, so what's Jesus saying? Like he wants us to be poor and blessed are you when you're poor. That's not what that's talking about. He's saying this. He's saying until we understand that there's nothing in any one of us that deserve the grace of God, like we're just never, ever going to completely understand what it means to be adopted as sons and daughters into the kingdom of God. Like we've got to understand our spiritual poverty before we can understand God's grace. And he ends Matthew 5 with these words, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Anybody as perfect as God here? No. Like we just can't be that. And again, Jesus' teaching was so revolutionary. Like none of us can be perfect except for the fact that Jesus came to do what we couldn't do. And so in his perfection, he dies on a cross for our sins, and he allows for us to experience God's righteousness placed on us. In other words, he takes people who, there's a song that is sometimes sung in church that uses this line, once your enemy, now seated at your table, Jesus, thank you. See, the words that Jesus uses here are about enemies. This is how you treat your enemy. And for many of us, the person in our life who's difficult to love, boy, we view more like an enemy than we view as somebody who is worthy of our love and can even move past that. Listen, I want to suggest that love is the relentless pursuit of the lifting up of others. There's lots of definitions for love. Romans 13 is a great definition of love. But boy, you want a great definition of love? Hey, if you're in your marriage, love is the relentless pursuit of the lifting up of your spouse. It means I'm going to keep trying to help them become the person that they're supposed to be. As a parent, love is the relentless pursuit of the lifting up of my kids. As an employee, love is the relentless pursuit of the lifting up of my coworkers, our organization, what it is that we're trying to accomplish. When I'm in a competitive relationship with somebody in a sales environment, love is the relentless pursuit of all of us winning in this deal. It's not just about me and my clients, it's about them and their clients, and it's about everybody winning. Love is the relentless pursuit of the lifting up of my neighbor who wants to mow my lawn. And it's the opportunity to try to look for ways to love him even when he irritates me. Love is the relentless pursuit of the lifting up of others. See, that's one of the best ways we can do this. Fred McCormick was a pastor here at Wooddale Church for years. He passed away several years ago. He was one of my heroes. When I came on staff at Wooddale, Fred was this bigger-than-life personality. He was the assistant to our senior pastor at the time, adult ministries pastor. Fred used to say, there's two types of people in this world. There's the person who comes in and like the party waiting to happen, like, hey, here I am, world, come on, here I am. I'm a here I am person, all right? And then there's the person who, when you're with them, they make you feel like you're the most special person in the world. You know they're for you. You know that they're with you. They're a there you are person. And sometimes the here I am people are the people that are on stages. They're the people who become celebrities. They're the people who, just the world tends to adore. They're the CEO of the company. But sometimes those people who are on those stages are there you are persons, and they've been able to get to that spot because of how they treated others in their life. And the person who makes the biggest difference in your life isn't normally the one on the stage. It's the one who's in the trenches with you. It's the one who you can go to when you're going through the hard time. It's the one who you can go to when they won't gossip. It's the one that you know that you can go to when you're dealing with the difficulty. And I just want to encourage you, what are you? Are you a here I am or a there you are person? And do you have there you are people in your life? Okay, I said we're going to end with this extra grace required deal. Because listen, sometimes there's just people that God puts in your life that nobody can stand. And he said, yeah, I know. But I put you in their life. And you may be the only person that's ever going to show this person love and dignity and respect. And sometimes I put these extra grace required people in your life so that you can help them become something more. You can help that diamond in the rough shine in ways like we've never dreamed of. I've had to see just really hard things happen with people before. We've just seen just people that have made horrible choices, and maybe they're no longer here, who like I dream of someday being the speaker up here. Like the extra grace required person in my life who will someday come back after, whatever it is that they've made these poor choices after poor choices, and someday will be the one who will be presenting up here and saying, hey, this was me, and let me tell you what happened. I think there's two types of EGR people, and one is an extra grace required temporary person. They're going through a difficult situation, and what they need right now is someone to rally around them and help support them. When your girlfriend's going through that divorce, or your coworkers, in a situation where their parents are in intensive care and they're worn out and they're just tired and they've been in that caregiver mode and they just need somebody to come alongside of them. Maybe it's an EGR temporary situation and they're a little bit off and they just need a little bit of grace right now. And what they don't need right now is you just like making their life even more miserable. They just need some grace right now to help them get through this time. And maybe God's put you in their life to be that person who says, hey, let me bring a meal by your house tonight. Or let me help you with the kids in the carpool this week. And you just go spend time with your dad right now. And we got you, all right? Then there's the extra grace required dominant person. Normal support hasn't resolved the issues. The circumstances have passed. The person continues to require extra grace. This is that person in your life who they're always causing conflict and difficulty around them. And with extra grace required people, I'm going to just fly. I just want to say, sometimes these people need to be treated with grace. I mean, that's what extra grace required means. They need to be handled with care. John 1:16, Jesus talks about this. I'm going to fly through here because I know there's some questions and I'm going to get there. But EGRs need to be treated with humility too. Just recognize when somebody's going through a crisis and it's temporary, or there's a mental health situation that's causing some of this, just handle with care. Again, try to walk in their shoes. Try to recognize that maybe there's some things that happened in childhood that have contributed to this. Again, you're not going to let this person abuse you. We're not going to let this person take advantage. We're going to have some boundaries in place, but let's treat with humility. Let's treat with balance as well. And again, there's verses here that I'm not going to read right now because of time. And we're happy to make this available to anybody. If you want to email us, we'll get you this presentation. But we need to treat people with balance and recognize that that's part of the deal. And there's a few verses here. It's actually the passage where Jesus has like this woman who's caught in adultery, and all these religious leaders want to stone her, and he's like handles it completely different than the religious leaders of his day. And he's like, hey, if you're without sin, you cast the first stone. And they all walk away because they know that we're all guilty. EGRs need to be treated like Christ would treat them. And remember, that's what extra grace is about. We've been given extra grace. We need to recognize that. They need to be taken into the truths of the gospel. And I can explain that to you on another day. If that's something that you don't know what I'm talking about, I'd love to talk with you about that at some point as well. Treated with integrity and above reproach. We love people like that. We love people who we know that I may disagree with this person, but I know they're a person of character. I may disagree with the conclusions that this person has, but I know that they're above reproach. And listen, none of us are completely there apart from God in our lives, but integrity matters, all right? And we need to pay attention to that. And now when I just close with this quote, and we'll open it up for some Q&A. There's a pastor named Ray Hollenbeck, and he wrote an article about extra grace required. It was a really popular term a few years ago that's not as popular anymore, but I wanted to end with this term because I think it's important. And he says, writing about this, and this pastor who just kind of went over the top in extra grace, he says, finally, this pastor had it backwards. Difficult people don't require extra grace. I do. The problem is not their requirement. It is my lack. When the depth of human need is beyond the limits of my patience and empathy, when the hurt and fear goes deeper than my ability to counsel it away, when I reach the boundaries of my Christ-likeness, I'm the one who needs the fuel of grace. I'm the one who needs grace to listen to others without the urge to move on to the next patient. I'm the one who needs to see Jesus in the face of each difficult, hurting person. I'm the one who requires not extra grace, but the real thing, the true supernatural substance from heaven, the grace of God. Ministry based upon my own resources will produce disciples that look like me, and that fearsome thought should be reason enough to cry out for the grace that sustains me. Listen, there's not a person alive that doesn't need grace. You're somebody's extra grace required person. Remember that. You are. We all are. At the beginning of that presentation, again, I asked you to close your eyes, and it's sobering to think that when somebody closes their eyes and they think about an extra grace required person, Brian Schulenburg is the person they think of. Oh, I don't want to be that person. But I am. We all are. And so may you show grace. I told you I'd say this one more time. And if you're in a relationship where the grace that is required is for an abuser, well, then you need to talk to somebody. And our office is a safe place to do that. We really want to be a place of integrity. We want to be a place where you can say, listen, I'm struggling with this. And we know the wait to get into counselors right now is really, really long in the Twin Cities and across the country. And so we can do some triage work. We'll walk with you. We've got a number of people who are trained in pastoral counseling. We've got an amazing ministry here called Stephen Ministry that isn't necessarily a counseling ministry, but it's a ministry for people who just need somebody to pray with them and somebody that they can talk to, and they know that it will be kept in confidence. Stephen Ministry, everything about it is confidential here at Wooddale Church. So, we don't even know, once we give that person to our Stephen Ministry team, who it is that they're meeting with as pastors. That's how confidential this is. We just want to make sure that anybody at Wooddale that just needs a friend, that needs somebody who will pray with them, who will sit down and talk with them and just be a sounding board that will take it to God in prayer, that's something that we have to offer. Again, not counselors, but people who are willing to pray. And then we'll help you find that counselor if you need that in that situation. Okay, thank you. Questions? I know we're at time, so I'll take two, and then I'll stick around here if you've got questions afterwards. But yes, in the back. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes. Yeah, great question. So, okay, yeah. So the question for those online, or the comment was, it used to be a little bit easier to do this when we at least had some values that society accepted, and today we live in a cancel culture. And so if we stand up for a value that others don't stand up for, what are you supposed to do? And many of you in this room, that's where you're at. I know. There's a relationship with a child that has diminished over different values, or a coworker, a friend, somebody else in culture. We talk about the internet trolls, and you never win those arguments online. And so I want to encourage you, don't be somebody who tries to win those arguments online. Posting about politics and about those issues online is never going to convince anybody. We're so embedded. What is going to change that, again, I believe, is if you're a person of faith and you're dealing with somebody who's not a person of faith, well, that person of faith shouldn't act like a person of faith. You should. That's our job. It's not the job of the person who's not a person of faith to believe what you believe. So our job, instead of coming back combative and I can't believe you believe that, well, why should they believe that? It's to take the time to build the bridge. And you may get canceled on the way to doing that because we can't control how other people act, but we can, again, control how we act in that relationship. So your response is then, in the midst of that, when you're being canceled, not to get defensive, not to be like, oh, but to show grace, because God did it with each of us, And for many who are Christians in the room, and maybe you, yesterday, my little grandson, who's going to be 3, I got this little beautiful video text that he gave his heart to Jesus yesterday, is what he told me. We had this little dance party in my office with him. And I got to talk to my grandson in Ohio for about an hour yesterday about that, okay? Now, if he continues to walk that way, and he'll have struggles and he'll have crisis, and he may walk away for a time in his life. I hope not, but he might, okay? He'll have some struggles, but he grew up in a home where that was kind of understood, and it was modeled, and his mom, kind of shared with him in that moment. So many people, that's not what they've experienced. And instead, what they've experienced is a church that kind of judges culture instead of loves culture. And until we, I think, do a better job, and I'm not saying you don't do that, I'm just saying that the church as a whole, I think, has done a really lousy job. And instead of just not expecting people who aren't believers to act like it, we instead fight back. And that's so not what Jesus said to do. He never said, So when your enemy criticizes you in social media, throw out every point of why they're wrong. No, he was like, if you get punched, turn the other cheek. Like it just, because he knew they just didn't get it. And what is it that is gonna make a difference in a world that is just struggling with that? Well, it's a church that reflects the character of Christ and that responds with love and grace and not expecting everybody else to believe the same thing instead. Now, that is easier said than done, because when we're in the heat of the argument and when we're at the Thanksgiving table or there's some criticism that's being thrown out at you by whatever, it's again, sometimes choosing not to say the thing that you want to say and putting yourself in their shoes. That's a really interesting perspective. Tell me a little bit more about that. And I could go on and on. We have another class we teach here that's during the school year about sharing your faith story. We actually go pretty deep into that topic. And how do you, in this culture that we live in today, tell your story, God's story, while listening to their story and find that bridge that you can build, even with people who are very different. Okay, one more question. Sorry, we've gone over today, but one more. Yes? Yep. All right. Well, I'm going to tell you, them mowing my lawn. I really shouldn't get that upset about that. I really should. That's my issue, and there are times where I just need to get out there and mow my lawn on time. And so my neighbor has never meant that as an angry thing. He's literally meant that to show love. So. Yeah. Oh, and I have. We've talked. That's an example I'm using, but you're right. That's what you do. You don't just So you have the conversation about what's important here, and how do I. Sometimes we allow ourselves to spend way too much emotional energy on an issue that really isn't that important. So when I'm doing premarital counseling with a young couple, we use a little foursquare about the stresses in our life, and the top square is what is the most crucial item that I'm dealing with here and easy to change. The next is what's a crucial item that's not easy to change, and then what's not really a crucial item that's easy to change, and what's not a crucial item that, frankly, I can just kind of forget about. And each square, you do something different. So if it's a crucial item and it's easy to change, well, what am I going to do about it is the question you asked there. Like, how am I going to take care of this issue in my life? If it's a crucial item like our family, but difficult to change, I can't change my family. I can't change who my parents are, my kids are. Well, how am I going to choose to deal with this situation? Each square has a different question. With my neighbor and mowing my lawn, that's probably not that crucial of a thing. And so the question there is, I'm just going to let that go, and I'm going to show appreciation. And that's kind of what I'm talking about there. So, all right, thank you for coming. If you've got questions, you want to keep talking, I'll stick around here for a little bit, but thank you for being here. Yeah, I did confuse it. Didn't mean to.